Hello and welcome to this Dialogues at Fulcrum podcast. Fulcrum is the commentary and analysis website of the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I'm Hwok, Senior Fellow at ISEAS, co-coordinator of the Malaysia Studies program, and one of the Fulcrum editors.
Morning, I'm Francis Hutchinson. I'm a colleague of Hwok at the Malaysia Studies program. So we're very excited to welcome today Meredith Weiss. Morning and welcome, or good evening to you, Meredith.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's a privilege indeed to have Meredith. She's actually currently ISEAS visiting senior fellow among the many hats that she wears. And we can't go through all of them, but I think, primarily, first and foremost, she is a professor of political science at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at the University at Albany, State University of New York. She'll be sharing with us her perspective, critical analyses, and ongoing research on the storied journey and current state of Malaysia's institutional reforms. Are things stalling, falling? Are they slowly progressing? This subject is timely, it's exciting for some, and perhaps exasperating for others. Meredith is a prolific scholar of Malaysia and Southeast Asia and a frequent traveler in the region, but not at this moment. As Francis mentioned, she's tuning in, and she's tuning in from New York City. So it's morning in Singapore and nighttime in New York, but in the city that never sleeps, anytime should be a good time for a robust podcast. Welcome again, Meredith. How are you this evening?
I'm fine. I'm awake, not sleeping.
Right. I've known you for many years now, and we tend to bump into each other now and again at conferences and election charamas, those Malaysian political rallies. I'm curious, though, how it all started, and I'm sure our Fulcrum podcast listeners are as well. So could you just share with us when and why did you become interested in Malaysia and Southeast Asia more broadly?
Sure. As an undergraduate, some of my chance, I took a class on Southeast Asian politics from Fred Vandermaiden, who was then this really wonderful professor at Rice University, where I was an undergrad. He's since passed away, but he was incredibly engaging, and he had known people like Anwar Ibrahim since they were students. He had been following Southeast Asian politics and Malaysian politics specifically for decades by that point, and showed slides in the days when this really was a slide carousel. Those slides told stories, made it all sound really quite fascinating. So within Southeast Asia, Malaysia really caught my attention for a few reasons. So there was a book that came out my senior year of undergraduate called Fragmented Vision, edited by Francis Lowe and Joel Kahn on social movements in Malaysia, which really made me quite intrigued at the possibility of looking more into things like environmental movements and consumers activism and Islamist activism and so forth. And then also I was really interested in questions of ethnic politics and political development broadly. The one thing that I really could never have anticipated is that at that time, this was still the days of Suharto, Lee Kuan Yew, and Mahathir. Lee Kuan Yew wasn't quite so monolithic as he had once been, but at the same time, definitely still there and still pulling strings. But never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined that this long into my career, Mahathir would still be around. I assumed all three of those would kind of vanish from the scene partway through my dissertation. So this was part of the question of what parts of Southeast Asia to focus on and what issues.
So let's open our conversation by talking about Pakatan and its policy from opposition to government. And let me provide a bit of context for our Dialogues at Fulcrum podcast listener. So Malaysia's reform journey can be traced back to 1998, of course, with the start of Reformasi. But maybe let's fast forward a little bit to 2008, which was preceded by the Hindraf rally and Bersi's first demonstration. After the 2008 elections, PKR, DAP, and PAS formed Pakatan Rakyat and championed democratic reforms. Pakatan intensified that campaign after the 2013 general election, which also became intertwined with the anti-corruption, anti-Najib cause. Of course, we know that PAS split with Pakatan, Amanah splintered from PAS, and remained with Pakatan Harapan. In the 2018 general election, Pakatan Harapan won with a manifesto of sweeping reforms. It lost power, of course, we know, in 2020. And then since 2022, Pakatan has been the linchpin of the unity government. So could you give us your take on the important milestones in Malaysia's reform journey? And what are the important achievements to you of the past 15 years?
Yeah, so I think the key achievement is actually closer to 25 years ago, which would really be forging a consistent core to a coalition that could rival the BN. So that was the Barisan Alternative in 1999, which really was so much the key innovation. Whatever one may deem the faults of the BN, the thing that really most defines it and makes it most remarkable for the Malaysian context is that it is multi-ethnic and broadly inclusive. So any real challenger to be viable needs to be as well. And part of the way that the BN has operated in the past has been really by fragmenting the opposition, by pushing it to the margins, Islamist or Chinese or something else, but not readily able to be combined. So that was really the first big step as a milestone. Beyond that point, though, more recently, we can look at things within those last 15 years or so. So the next big thing I would say would be winning a cluster of state governments, which, a little bit earlier, but really from 2008 on. That achievement and maintaining control, particularly in Penang and Selangor, but also elsewhere, allowed Pakatan to model its approach to governance and to get some practice in governing, and really help to clarify the boundary between the federal government and state governments. Because when all are governed by the same coalition or party, it can be hard to see where one ends and the other begins. Once you have that separation of power, then you, because of a different coalition, then you can really see what one coalition can do and what is beyond its ambit, because it's actually a separate administration or separate jurisdiction. So the next big thing was really to win a cluster of state governments fairly consistently from 2008 on. So especially Penang and Selangor, but also other states. Doing that allowed Pakatan to model its approach to governance and to get practice in governing. But it also really helped to clarify the boundary between the federal government and a state government, since when both are under the same coalition, the same party, it can be hard to see where the jurisdiction of one leaves off and the next begins. And that really matters in terms of devolution of authority and in terms of to whom citizens should turn if they want something changed. So that itself was really a key factor in allowing Pakatan to build from the state level to the federal level, and to be better prepared to govern when they did so. But so the next thing was really reconstituting itself after the departure of PAS in 2015. So PAS was so critical to the coalition. It's easy to forget now, I think. But if one thinks about the role that PAS plays with Bersatu in Pakatan Nasional now, that is providing basically the entirety of the ground game, more or less, that was really, without too much overstatement, what PAS was also for Barisan Alternative and then initially for Pakatan Rakyat, in the sense that so much of security at Chirama or mobilizing of voters or whatever else was really up to PAS's incredibly well-organized loyal ground troops. And so for Pakatan to be able to regroup with the shard of PAS, which is Amanah, which is important, which still maintains a sort of Islamist justice piece, the keadilan message through an Islamist lens, but has nowhere near the ground game and the capacity of PAS. That's really quite impressive. And the fact that Pakatan was able to continue beyond the departure of PAS, I think also signaled its viability as a coalition. And then I think the last thing would be just the simple persistence of winning a majority of the popular vote in 2013, then a parliamentary majority in 2018, then a plurality, but being able to form a coalition to govern in 2022. The latter two of those wins, 2018 and 2022, both involved some really tough compromises in partnering first with Bersatu and Mahathir, and now with the BN in particular, as well as its other partners. But at the same time, the fact that it was able to maintain its cohesion and continue forward despite some really hard knocks, I think really is quite significant achievement.
Hey, thanks so much for sharing, and I think you're laid out very, very clearly and succinctly. a whole 25 years sweep of time, mainly from the perspective of the parties that were involved and how they attained government, and that sort of laying the basis, right, for reforms over time. Let's focus a bit on the leadership now, and obviously we have to start with the icon of Reformasi himself, Anwar Ibrahim, but maybe expanding beyond that as well. Cabinet members over time and party leaders. I mean, how much do you see both, I think, the hits and the misses, in this reform journey deriving from political leadership?
Right. It's really hard to say, of course, but I think one of the perhaps weaknesses of Pakatan's reform record is that it really hasn't shifted Malaysia from being a very leader-centered polity. So again, when I first started out, I never imagined that Mahathir would be a key political player for so very, 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 very long. But he has been, and that's partly because the system so much had developed, from the 1980s onwards around him. And it still is so much a leader-led, leader-oriented system. Some of that systems of patronage help to reinforce. Some of that is really manifested at the more local level, in the form not of the party leader per se, but of some local politician who's been there for eons and shows no sign of leaving, and does well by their constituents, but at the same time, evades turnover and so forth. But I think overall leadership has been both a boon and an albatross for the coalition. So Mahathir himself is Exhibit A. He helped Pakatan win, undoubtedly, in 2018, but he was even more instrumental in Pakatan's collapse in 2020. Now, and really since the Barisan Alternative days of the late 1990s, the coalition has been so wrapped up with Anwar that it hasn't really perhaps developed a viable plan for a succession beyond that. So that's especially true for Anwar's own party, Keadilan, PKR. It still has yet to develop any clear identity apart from its coalition and its leader. And that leaves its future as a party less certain than it could or should be. It's very easy to see the possibility of yet more factional rifts, as happened in 2020, dividing this party again as a contest for leadership arises should Anwar unexpectedly, without the chance, should he ever decide to plan for succession, without the chance to do so. And of course, one hopes that doesn't happen. But at the same time, all things are possible in life and politics. And so that really is a weakness for the coalition, is that there are so many really excellent people involved with Pakatan, many of whom are unable to determine what their full capacity could be if given the chance to thrive. That said, I think it's also hard to change the script. So some of this really is about leaders, and too many leaders thought that only they are the one who can make things go as they should, that they are the necessary piece in a functioning reformist democracy, which of course we know is not what democracies are supposed to be about. But voters' expectations are also a real factor. So voters may vote for change, they may want a new leader, but they're still acculturated to the old way of doing things. And so, for instance, however much they do sincerely oppose corruption, most also still want the benefits of what is essentially patronage, not in a nefarious way, not KKN, corruption, collusion, and nepotism type patronage, but in the form of politicians who show that they care and are accountable by going to the ground and spending money. And so that's part of how people develop a personal vote, develop their persona as a politician. And if you're a member of the cabinet, you have even more resources to dole out or more ability to claim credit for what the government has done. But that then keeps the system very leader-oriented as opposed to policy-oriented or programmatically inclined.
Yeah, so maybe just jumping off on that last point about being, about the policies themselves and not being just so fixated on the leadership. And maybe now we can segue into a bit of the administration of Anwar Ibrahim, because as the Reformasi leader and you can, champion all that, I think, in a little more naturally, right, as an opposition leader. But is he a reformist prime minister? I think you have a vantage point of looking at some of the nitty-gritty and being able to distill, I think, what are some of the actual operation, what is operationally, what is feasible and desirable. So I think one way we can grapple with this question, not so much getting to the head of Anwar, but also just sort of entering into the space of the administration and what they're doing, what they actually can do. And I'd like to hear also from a more normative standpoint, what do you think are two of the three reforms that the unity government could implement, are the most feasible and desirable ones and the most impactful ones?
Right.
And could I just jump in, Meredith, in one of your presentations with us a number of weeks ago rather, you said something that to me was very powerful. You said the way that we should look at the unity government is not as a reformist government, but as a government with reformists in it. And I thought that was very powerful. And so perhaps you could, within your answer now, kind of unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So I think thinking of this government as one that has reformists in it really helps us to think through what reforms might be possible, because that suggests that having a champion for reform, even if the government itself seems to lack quite the political will or motivation to pursue a clear agenda, that may suffice. That, in other words, there may be space for personal initiative in this still very leader-oriented government to make a difference. And I think we do see several people like that, and several different reforms that they might possibly be able to push through. So identify three, and I'll link those with people. So the first, which would be perhaps my number one choice for what it might be both feasible and genuinely high impact, would be political finance. So I think this is feasible in part because the legislature, Parliament, has come so close to enacting political finance legislation already in the past. They have multiple models that have been workshopped, that have been developed, mostly drawing on the work of the think tank ISEAS, Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs. And there are key supporters who are committed reformists within government. So Wong Chen is one I can mention, who would be especially keen, I think, and is well placed, at least to advocate. That doesn't mean it gets done, but it means that if there's a chance really to start to develop momentum again, there are people in place who would really push for this. And so what might pass would probably not be the best political finance bill one could possibly hope for, but pretty much anything would be an improvement on the all but nothing there is in place now. So I think that would be a good step. The second thing should be simple, because even Najib proposed doing this, and so it should be feasible and it would have some impact, and that is to repeal the Sedition Act. There are any number of these acts. The word draconian has always been the moniker of choice, or the adjective, I should say, of choice for these. Let me restart it. The word draconian has generally been the adjective of choice for describing this slate of enactments that one might want to repeal in line with Pakatan's generally reformist ideas. And yet none of that really seems to have much headway right now. However, the Sedition Act is the one that has been most touted over the years as able to be repealed because it's essentially superfluous. So the various things that the Sedition Act might protect Malaysia against, there are other laws that will also address. All sorts of objections can be raised, because objections can be raised to anything and will be. But at the same time, this is the sort of thing that Azalina Othman, who is perhaps the chief person right now pressing for reforms, somewhat ironically, not from Pakatan, but from UMNO. This is amongst the sorts of legal reforms that she says that she aims to champion. And she's in a position as Minister for Law, which is under the Prime Minister's department, that perhaps she could push this through. I will say, though, that I'm not entirely convinced that she has the clout to be able to force through the agenda that she would like to address. And the third thing I'll mention, which is probably harder just given politics and especially the demands of Sabah and Sarawak, and I'll come back to that, but should be feasible and is hugely important, is electoral redelineation. This is feasible because by 2026, there's supposed to be a redelineation exercise. It could be earlier if Parliament increases the number of seats. That seems probably not likely. What makes this unlikely to happen in the way that one might wish is the administration's bluntly pandering to East Malaysia at this point and seeming on the cusp of agreeing to grant them 1/3 of seats in parliament, which, yes, was in the initial agreement when Singapore was also part of that bloc that came in, the three S's, Singapore, Sabah, and Sarawak, but at the same time would tremendously increase the skew that is already so disturbingly present in the Malaysian parliament in terms of how much a voter counts, how much each vote counts, which is directly proportionate to how skewed the distribution of votes and seats are. And so there are all sorts of electoral reforms that could be really useful. After 2018, there was an electoral reform commission that talked about a lot of them, everything from minor tweaks. Right now, there's a lot of discussion on appointments of election commissioners and the chair of the EC, the Election Commission, to revamping the system to introduce proportional representation or mixed member majoritarianism or something else. Those big changes, like changing from first past the post to proportional representation, not going to happen. I can say with some confidence. If I'm wrong, great, but I don't think so. But substantially reducing malapportionment and gerrymandering both would go a long way toward making elections more fair. And so that to me seems technically feasible and likely to have a really substantial impact, as well as being quite in line with Pakatan's premises, even if it's pressed more by people like William Wong, the name will attach to this one, rather than really a chief goal of the government at large.
Yeah, you are touching on one aspect of this, the politics, right, of or the electoral base of Pakatan, especially being more urban centric, and of course I think this is one of those issues that is intertwined with reforms that it's mainly the urban electorate that demands it, and holds government account and so on. I mean, how do you read this issue moving forward? I mean, is there more room to do reforms that will benefit all, or is it more a question of messaging? Because many of these actually do, and specifically about the electoral malapportionment, right? That is disenfranchising the vote of the urban voters, right? Is that also one opportunity to engage in this reform?
Yeah, messaging would really do a lot, and part of I think the failings of the administration in 2018 was really not getting ahead of the message, letting the opposition, sometimes vehement, sometimes crass, sometimes vitriolic opposition, really co-opt the message and run with it. So it made it very difficult for Pakatan to accomplish even picking off low-hanging fruit. That said, I think one of the things that makes it especially difficult to pursue reforms like electoral redelineation is that that's a situation that specifically benefits rural voters who are not currently Pakatan supporters to such a huge extent. And so redelineation that will benefit urban voters who are grossly underrepresented by how much larger their constituencies are. So, well over 100,000 voters may elect one MP versus 15,000, the tiniest of constituencies to elect one MP. Redressing that skew will benefit Pakatan because of the grossly disproportionate placement of voters, that over 100,000 voters in an urban area will vote for one MP versus, maybe 15 or 20,000 voters in the smallest of constituencies in smaller and or geographically large but very rural and spread out areas. In the past, PAS also benefited in more urban areas, so closer to Kota Baru and Kelantan, for instance. However, in recent years, PAS has become so overwhelmingly dominant on the East Coast, which is where we have some of these numerically smaller constituencies, that redressing the malapportionment and rural weightage issues, as well as gerrymandering, may be seen as politically vindictive, that may attract an especially stringent amount of pushback from the opposition. So in that sense, this is something that would in fact benefit all voters by making their votes more equal. And it's worth bearing in mind that I think we're up to about 78% of Malaysians who are urban. So this is not a minority of the population, but it's still controversial. Other things though that can really help to spread benefits of reform more widely and are really easy to message, such that Pakatan looks good for doing it, even if the opposition also gets some benefit, would be things like granting equal constituency development funds, the parliamentary allocations to all MPs. So right now, the funds go to governing coalition MPs and not to others. Those funds may still reach their constituencies, but through governing coalition channels. And this is something that Pakatan inherited from the BN. So there's not really additional spending involved in making this change, but it would make Pakatan look good and look generous. It would help to distribute benefits of the government down to the grassroots in ways that may be popular with voters. And so it doesn't allow Pakatan to claim credit for all things in quite the same ways, but this is something that might make voters in some ways sympathetic to the idea of reform. Another thing that would help to spread the benefits that, again, could be pretty easy to message, and that makes Pakatan look good, but would also perhaps benefit voters more widely and perhaps spread those benefits beyond the already core voters for Pakatan, would be devolution of greater resources and authority to the state or even municipal level. So issues like healthcare, public transit, and so forth are not just concerns for the densely urban areas that already support Pakatan, but also for areas like Kuantan, for instance, on the East Coast, which has had so much trouble over the years in developing public transit because that's controlled by the federal government. And, really having local leaders be able to make decisions on those sorts of issues would make so much more sense. After the pandemic in particular, during the pandemic, you heard more and more pushback about the lack of health authorities in places like Sabah and Sarawak to be able to make their own decisions on some issues of public health, of allocation of resources, of hiring staff, and so forth, that those are areas as well in which we may just have better governance, which is a good thing to help attract support. A very easy, it seems, small change, which would also benefit voters who may or may not support Pakatan, but may help to widen the base, would be implementing a better system for absentee or postal voters. If you think about those from East Malaysia and the East Coast in particular, who are more likely to be outstationed at the time of elections, in the Klang Valley, for instance, for work or for studying, and who may find it especially expensive or difficult to travel home to vote if they're still registered in their home kampung, their home constituency. So those are the sorts of changes that Pakatan could implement, and has made a little bit of a headway only at one point on the postal balloting. But that would really help to show that this administration can benefit all Malaysians without just favoring the urban voters who already support Pakatan.
Of course, many people harbor high expectations of reforms, and parties have promised bold reforms. And there is a long list of reforms that have not been achieved or have been stalled, and reform promises that have been broken or gone back on. So we've talked about some of the things that are feasible, but could you share with us your opinion on some of the biggest institutional reform failures and or the biggest missed opportunities? What could have been done that was not done?
Yeah, I'll answer this fairly succinctly, which is to say that I think Pakatan has done too little to address the three biggest issues that propelled it into office. That would be corruption, elections, and civil liberties. So on corruption, there's a host of issues tied up with that. They started off well in 2018 with reform efforts, but even now, asset declarations are haphazard. We have MPs on GLCs. The public prosecutor and attorney general are still fused, which makes it difficult to pursue cases and so forth. On elections, 2018, the law that reduced the voting age and introduced automatic registration, that's a good change. But there's even more disproportion now across constituencies. There's still all but no campaign finance legislation. There's still limited improvement in things like increasing access to the ballot for those who have difficulty accessing it, and so forth. And then lastly, on civil liberties, this is where some really easy to celebrate wins would make Pakatan supporters happy, at what should be a comparatively low cost if Pakatan could only get a better grip on the process of messaging. So, introducing, if there's a media council, make sure it's really a pro-media council and not something that's designed to increase control. Don't arrest people or charge people with, let's not just stay type charges. Really respect freedoms of association, press, and speech, and so forth.
Okay, so Malaysia's political transformation in recent years has included a shift towards more fluid coalitions. And this has also seen demonstrations of bipartisanship on the one hand and a return to the two-thirds majority in parliament as a threshold, mental perhaps, of stability. Prime Minister Ismail Sabri, here we go back in time, his administration formed a confidence and supply memorandum of understanding between the government and Pakatan Harapan, which passed the anti-hopping law and the 2022 budget. In your forthcoming ISEAS Perspective article, you point out that the Bipartisan Parliamentary Special Select Committee, these committees are playing a bigger role. Do you see Malaysian democracy maturing in the sense of building alliances on select issues and the opposition being constructive at time as opposed to being persistently obstructionist?
I do see at least some in the opposition as understanding and taking good advantage of the space for an engaged opposition. And we have had some bills passed with bipartisan support in recent years, which is a good thing. Having select committees that are not only bipartisan in composition, but may also have opposition MPs as chairs is really useful in both signaling a desire to have compromise, to have bipartisan support, and in really facilitating that. Increasing and using the space for deliberation is also just a way to make better policies, to gather constructive input from advocates, from civil society, and from across members of parliament who may have an interest and some knowledge, to tap expertise that any given MP might lack. They can't be experts in all things, and really to hash out details as well as securing buy-in. So we've seen some efforts to do that in a meaningful way. The Generation Endgame, the anti-smoking legislation, was a clear effort in the last administration to try to do that, to build support before voting on the legislation. So I'm not sure that maturing is really the right term, because that implies age. And I say this with presidential debate in the US 2 days ahead of this recording, or 3 days ahead of this recording. So the US is both the oldest democracy and quite possibly the most dysfunctional at this point, especially in terms of knee-jerk obstructionism. So I would offer that sort of cautionary note that the fact of a more constructive process now doesn't necessarily imply that it'll stay that way. But I do think that the yen toward some level of bipartisan participation is really a useful and good thing for Malaysian politics.
You've already brought up civil society, and you've also studied Southeast Asia and Malaysian civil society very extensively, and of course, it's one of the key pillars in this process. How do you see Malaysian civil society, its journey over these years, and needing to having the high expectations, maybe learning the ropes, having to set new expectations, being more patient? You've already touched on that, but can you expand just very, very briefly? How is it now compared to maybe 5 years ago?
Yeah, I think the change, it helps to take a slightly longer perspective than 5 years, just because I'm not sure that the change has been so dramatic in just that time. But at the same time, we could actually just go back to 2018, which is not much longer than 5 years, to suggest one key evolutionary step, which was forming the CSO platform for reform, which was an effort really to try to bring the gamut of advocacy organizations for a range of issues on board for a cohesive, coherent effort, to join forces, to share ideas, to engage with members of parliament, and really to try to figure out the best ways forward for different goals. One of the things that makes reform more challenging in Malaysia compared with elsewhere, but makes the role of civil society perhaps even more pivotal, is that Malaysia hasn't had the sort of transition that we've seen in Indonesia or the Philippines or in Thailand, for instance. There was never an authoritarian dictatorship that was overthrown. This was a transition by elections. The same players are still in place. So even before the BN entered the coalition with Pakatan, we still had first Mahathir, as Pakatan's prime minister, but then also people like Anwar, who came to power initially under the BN, under the old regime. So in that sense, this is more of a partial shift or an evolutionary shift than a great transformation. And so part of the continuing thread that can help continue to push this coalition along is civil society. We can't expect the same sort of radical shift in parties and politicians that we can when there's been an overthrow of the new order of Marcos Sr.'s dictatorship in the Philippines. And so in that sense, the role for civil society is key, but it also means that it may be hard to gain traction, to gain leverage. So many from within civil society, starting in the late 1990s, made the jump from NGO-based advocates to political parties. So not just Anwar's Keadilan, but also joining the DAP, joining PAS, joining other parties. And that involves some necessary loss of civil society's ability to serve as a check and an independent voice when they're umbilically linked, to so many opposition parties and opposition goals. And so I think that has been really a learning curve in and of itself for civil society, of figuring out how much they will or won't be included in things like local councils. So in Penang and Selangor, both, we saw promises to incorporate civil society advocates as local councillors. Those promises, Pakatan essentially reneged on, or how much space there'll be for civil societal advocates to be involved in consultations in a meaningful rather than checking off the box way once Pakatan came into government at the federal level. And so I think these efforts from civil society to reorganize, to regroup, to stay at least somewhat energized, somewhat optimistic, are both laudable and continually difficult.
Let's now zoom out and take an international view. So you've extensively studied comparative politics, you've authored books on party machinery and grassroots politics in Southeast Asia, and it is natural for a reformist opposition to demand democratic reforms, especially in Malaysia, and it's described or has been described, you've touched on this, as an electoral authoritarian regime or semi or pseudo-democratic state, or a range of labels. And it's common for reformist parties that win power to find it difficult to execute these reforms.
Right.
Because the process is difficult, or because anti-democratic tools become handy for keeping power. Comparing Pakatan with reformist parties or coalitions that took power in other countries, how do you view Pakatan's lack of sustained and effective delivery of reforms?
This answer would probably be quite different were you to pose this question 5 or 10 years ago versus now. Because now we have such a intensive process of democratic backsliding through so much of Southeast Asia, including those places that had the most remarkable reform transitions, movements, and so forth in Southeast Asia. So the Philippines and Indonesia are really key cases in this vein. And so here we have governments that came in Indonesia in 1998. We had the fall of Suharto. Habibie came in briefly, then elections in 99, a series of elections after that point. Really radical reforms, everything from decentralization to remaking the laws on political parties to introducing new judicial structures, anti-corruption measures, the autonomy, secession referendum in Timor-Leste and so forth, just really transforming Indonesia's system. And now we have a new order general who's been elected as president, who will likely, it seems probable, do away with some of the local level elections, for instance, perhaps back down on some civil liberties gains and so forth. We don't know yet what will happen once Prabowo was inaugurated in October, but it's probably not fantastic for liberalizing reforms. In the Philippines, likewise, we have the moment of transition in 1986 after the Marcos Sr. dictatorship. We have, all sorts of reforms. A key thing in Indonesia, I forgot to mention, was eliminating dui fungsi, the dual role of the military and government politics. In the Philippines as well, we see a military-backed dictatorship overthrown in part by defections from the military. But then after a very brief period under the new constitution with term limits and kind of decentralization and all sorts of other improvements to the democratic process and so forth, we see regression. And so first, it's through a general process of, a highly corrupt aspect within politics, really endemic vote buying, clan politics that really proved intransigent to change, repeated coup attempts that never really got very far, and so forth. Now we see, again, not just a member of that former dictatorial administration, but the son of the dictator himself, having been elected as president in the Philippines on the heels of an arguably even bloodier and more would-be dictatorial leader in the form of Rodrigo Duterte. And so we can see these sorts of rapid reforms that might be possible where there is, as I mentioned just now, a full-scale transformation from authoritarianism to democracy, but it's really hard to sustain those reforms. And I think that might be the light in which we take Malaysia's much slower progress toward much smaller scale reforms, is that at least if they're incremental and agreed upon and so forth, maybe there'll be less chance of overturning them. And that, while the rest of the region is generally seen to be backsliding in democratic terms, democracy is eroding. In Malaysia, it may not be progressing anywhere rapidly, but at least it doesn't seem to be backsliding. We don't see signs of real regress, whereas at this time, not just in Southeast Asia, but globally, we see the rise of populism. We see the rise of a deeply polarized, deeply difficult politics with problems for those who would want to see a more liberal politics and more consensus-oriented, less polarized policymaking. And so perhaps this is really, if Malaysia just holds its ground and simply avoids the Sheraton 2.0, another fall of the government, maybe that's itself a sign that it's actually doing pretty well because it's going against a tide.
Well, thank you so much, for sharing such a rigorously informed perspective and analysis. I think, I think we're kind of more in the company of people, right? With misery, enjoying sharing the misery about broken promises, right, and disappointments. I think in international, regional perspective, maybe it's really not so bad. And considering how difficult it is, and there actually has been progress, a more tempered perspective, right? I think it does call for, this sort of more tempered perspective. But I think this is an expansive conversation and can go on and on, but alas, we have to conclude. And you are a professor. We will just finish in the way that you have recently just concluded a semester. It's the dreaded thing, the grading and that drudgery, but I think we accept it's a necessary evil. So, if you were grading Malaysia's reform achievements, what grade would you give Malaysia?
I'd probably give Malaysia a C. It's satisfactory, but it's not exactly fantastic. But I would see this as a course that continues into the next semester, such that if there's improvement, I might retroactively revise that grade.
Very rigorous application of the methodology. Thank you very much, Professor.
My pleasure.
So with this, we conclude our podcast. You've really given us, I think, a very, very structured analysis, going back in time, beginning back in the early days, taking us through the processes, looking at both the positives as well as the negatives. You've then summarized where we are at the present time, and then we've also embedded this analysis within a wider regional context. So as colleagues, as well as students of yours today in this course, in this lecture, we come away enriched and with a deeper knowledge and appreciation of Malaysia's reform efforts and lack thereof, as well as possibilities for future reform going forward, as well as a keener understanding of some of the missed opportunities, as well as some of the structural reasons behind why those opportunities were missed. So thank you very much, and we look forward to having you with us again in other podcasts in the future, as well as giving seminars at ISEAS as well.